Sometimes we don't realize how good we have things until they're stripped away from us in the middle of a wilderness experience. You see, wilderness experiences have a way of tempering us and testing us. However, if we will turn to God in the midst of those experiences rather than away from Him, we'll find that He can use them to shape us, to raise us back up, and to make us a blessing to others on the other side of it. Such was the case of a man named Joseph, recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 30 to chapter 50. We could spend several months unpacking all of the lessons that we could learn from these 21 chapters, but today we're going to actually specifically focus on what it has to teach us about how God works with us in our wildernesses. Wilderness experiences can be particularly challenging for those who've come from a place of privilege, such as Joseph did. In chapter 37, verse 3, it tells us that Israel, that's the new name for Jacob, who we looked at last week, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his brothers because he was born to him in his old age. As a result of this, he actually had a special robe, ornate robe, made for Joseph and Joseph alone. Now, being treated as a favorite is not your fault, but how one responds to such treatment can make all the difference in the world in our relationships with other people. At first look, Joseph seems kind of like a spoiled kid. The first thing we hear about him in his story here is that he was out when he was 17, he was helping his brothers tend sheep, and something must have happened because we're told that he came back and he brought their father a bad report about them. He had no qualms about parading around in his special robe, even though this robe indicated that he was special and other people were not. And when he had a special dream, he felt compelled to share it with others, even if it made them look subservient to him. In chapter 37, verse 6 and 7, he says to his brothers, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding our sheaves out in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, while all of your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." And in chapter 37, verse 9, he went on to tell his brothers and his father, "Listen, I had another dream. This time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Those words have always seemed kind of cocky to me. But as I've been reflecting on this further, it's occurred to me that maybe Joseph was simply one of those sincere, tell-it-like-it-is kind of people who don't filter. If something seems wrong to them, they say it's wrong. If they have a dream, they share it, not thinking of how it might impact other people. Even though it would ultimately turn out that Joseph's dreams would prove to be true, that didn't win him any friends. In fact, we're told 3 times that his brothers hated him or hated him even more. One time we're told that they were jealous of him. Another time we're told that they plotted to kill him. And when he couldn't resist telling that second dream to his father Israel rebuked him. Not long after this, Joseph entered into what would turn out to be a 13-year wilderness journey. And from the ways in which he responded to God and how God worked in his circumstances, I believe that we can see how God can use such times in our lives to temper us, to test us, and ultimately to raise us up and make us a blessing to others. As we read these chapters, we see that Joseph was tempered by circumstances beyond his control. Most wilderness experiences we go through are not simply a downhill slide and then the gradual rise up the hill. Rather, they tend to be up and down and up and down. In fact, one of the challenges we have in the current COVID wilderness that we're in, COVID-19 wilderness, is we've had so many downs and then ups and then downs again, and it goes on and on. In this chapter, Joseph had experienced at least 3 major downward turns. He goes from being a favored son to having his life threatened and then being sold as a slave into Egypt, after which his brothers tried to lead their father to believe that he had been torn apart by some wild beast. Later, he goes from being a trusted manager of an important household in the government of Pharaoh to being falsely accused by his master's wife and unjustly thrown into prison. In jail, he goes from being a trusted steward who accurately interpreted the dreams of important people working for Pharaoh, only to be immediately forgotten by them. All three downward progressions had a tempering effect on Joseph. But he refused to give in to bitterness, instead applying himself fully to what he could do next. And God honored him in the process. His character was also severely tested in this wilderness, both by trials as well as successes. To begin with, his integrity, trustworthiness, and purity were tested by Potiphar's wife trying to seduce him. We're told in chapter 39, verse 6 through 7, and then in verse 10, that Joseph was well-built and handsome as well as successful, and after a while his master's wife took notice of him and said, "Come to bed with me." And we're told later in verse 10 that though she spoke in this way to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. In fact, he refused to even be with her. His trust in God was also tested after having accurately interpreted the dream of the king's cupbearer. When that happened, Joseph said to him in chapter 40, verse 14 to 15, "But when all goes well with you, please remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put into a dungeon." But the cupbearer completely forgot Joseph once he was restored, as Joseph had predicted. And he didn't give Joseph another thought for 2 whole years. Joseph's humility was also tested. 2 times he could have taken credit for the ability God gave him to interpret dreams. First of all, in chapter 40, verse 8, he says to Pharaoh's cupbearer, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" He said, don't look to me. God has the ability to interpret your dreams. And then later, when Pharaoh said to him in chapter 41, verse 15 to 16, "I have heard it said that you are one who, when you are told a dream, when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." To which Joseph replies, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he deserves." The key in each of these tests is that Joseph turned to God and he sought to honor God in all that he did. Listen to what he says to his master's wife in chapter 39, verse 9. He says to her, My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against my God?" When he's forgotten by Pharaoh's cupbearer, he continues simply to serve and to honor both God and the head jailer who had put him in charge in his role as jail steward for 2 more years until Pharaoh finally called him up. And as we've already seen, he unhesitatingly pointed both the cupbearer and Pharaoh himself to God as the only one who could give him the ability to interpret dreams. Ultimately, as Joseph actively looked to the Lord in the midst of these wilderness downturns, God raised him up and made him a blessing to others. First of all, God made him a blessing to Potiphar, his master. Though he came as a slave in Potiphar's house, chapter 39, verse 2 to 5 tells us that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And that led Joseph to find favor in his master's eyes. and to put him in charge of all his entire household. And then we're told finally in verse 5 that from the time that Potiphar put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything that Potiphar had. God made Joseph a blessing to Potiphar, even though he was a slave. God also made him a blessing to the jailer. Though Joseph was framed and put into jail unjustly, in chapter 39, verse 21 to 23, we're told that the Lord was again with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden who put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison and who made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. He did this because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And then thirdly, God made him a blessing to Pharaoh, to all of Egypt, to his own family, and ultimately to the rest of the region. Though the cupbearer had forgotten him, God gave Pharaoh 2 dreams that no one could interpret until the cupbearer suddenly realized what he called his shortcomings. He told Pharaoh about this young Hebrew could interpret dreams, and God enabled Joseph not only to interpret Pharaoh's dream, but also to offer him godly wisdom regarding what to do about that dream. And as a result, Pharaoh made Joseph second in command over all of Egypt. And in this capacity, Joseph saved all of Egypt. He amassed great wealth for Pharaoh. He kept people from other nations from starving. And he saved his own father and all of the children of Israel. What's striking is what Joseph was like after he emerged from his 13-year wilderness journey. Because he refused to give in to bitterness when he was being tempered, instead applying himself to what he could do. And because he turned to God and sought to honor God when he was tested, when he emerged from this wilderness, he continued to focus on God. He didn't say, oh, the problem's over, now I don't have to worry about God, I just do my own thing. He refused to let power go to his head. Some people have said that if Joseph hadn't gone through all of this, he could never have been second to Pharaoh in all the land. Though he was second only to Pharaoh, he did not stand on his own rights. We're told in chapter 43, verse 32, that because the Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to Egyptians, rather than insisting because of his position they still had to eat at his table, Joseph graciously ate at his own tables while they ate at theirs. And because chapter 46, verse 33 to 34 tells us that all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians, he had his family settle, all of whom were shepherds. He had them settle in a section of Egypt that was their own, a section that the Egyptians really were not that interested in, but ironically became one of the best parts of the land of Egypt. And he also continued to faithfully pursue what was best for Pharaoh, whom he served. He carefully guided the whole land through 7 years of famine. And he amassed possessions and power for Pharaoh, not lining his own pockets in the process. Finally, he refused to take revenge on his brothers whom sold him into slavery. Instead, helping them to grow, because God had given him understanding of God's wider purpose of in his wilderness experience. Listen to this that he says to his brothers when he reveals himself to them. He says to them, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into slavery in Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead to preserve your life and preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives with a great deliverance. Later on, after their father had died and they were afraid, oh, now he's going to kill us now that Dad's dead, Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph came to understand how God used the purpose of God in a wider way in taking him through this wilderness experience. Especially if things in our lives were pretty good prior to our present wilderness experience. This time could be especially challenging for you and for me. Circumstances beyond our control have a way of tempering us, and we can find our characters severely tested. But from Joseph's example here, we learn that if we refuse to give in to bitterness, which can debilitate us, instead giving ourselves and our energies to all those things that God puts us in front of us that we can do, and if we will turn to God and to seek to honor him in all that we do and say, then we can be confident that he will raise us up and he will make us a blessing to others on the other side of our wilderness. And that is the good news.